What if the most feared rulers in history did not conquer through armies, but through the invisible wounds they carved inside the minds of everyone around them? Imagine standing in a throne room where a single glance from a woman in power could unravel your certainty, distort your perception, and reshape your loyalty without lifting a sword. This is the unsettling heart of female domination, built not on physical force, but on psychological control, a form of power far more unpredictable and far more terrifying. And when you start looking closely, you notice a pattern. These women ruled through fear not because they lacked strength, but because they understood the human mind too well. The stories that survived the ancient empires and medieval courts often hide what people feared to admit. Psychological warfare was a weapon refined by women who learned to manipulate the deepest human vulnerabilities. They navigated environments that denied them authority, so they built their own kind of dominion in the shadows, using silence, uncertainty, and emotional disruption as strategic tools. When a queen could make an entire court doubt their own thoughts, she no longer needed loyal soldiers. She owned something far more valuable: obedience born from confusion. What makes this psychological domination so disturbing is not the cruelty itself, but the precision. These women did not threaten with swords, they threatened with possibilities. They mastered the art of delayed clarity, saying just enough to create unease, and leaving just enough unsaid to provoke paranoia. A subtle change in tone, a pause at the wrong moment, or a whispered rumor released at the perfect time could push allies into rivalry and rivals into desperation. The palace became a stage where every gesture carried hidden meaning, and no one ever knew whether they were safe or being watched. But the most frightening element was how easily these tactics could pass as kindness. A ruler could smile while dismantling someone's confidence. She could praise you publicly while privately planting the seed of your downfall. She could offer protection while slowly eroding your sense of autonomy. Fear wrapped in elegance, power hidden beneath composure, strategy disguised as affection. And those who lived under these women soon learned that the greatest danger was not punishment, but uncertainty, the constant feeling that your fate depended on emotions you could not predict or understand. And here is the part that people rarely acknowledge. These psychological tactics worked not because people were weak, but because the human mind is naturally vulnerable to doubt, desire, and the need for approval. These rulers weaponized what already exists inside us. They understood the patterns. They exploited the cracks. And the more you study their methods, the more you realize how uncomfortable the truth becomes. Have you ever felt controlled by silence, by mixed signals, by someone who always seemed one step ahead of your thoughts? If anything in this opening resonates with you, pause for a second and leave a comment sharing your experience. It helps you understand the content on a deeper level, and it helps this channel reach more people who search for this kind of historical insight. While you are here, remember to like the video and check if you are already subscribed, because what comes next will take you even deeper into the hidden world behind these psychological tactics. And as we move forward, the shadows surrounding these women become even more unsettling, guiding us toward the next layer of their power. As you move deeper into the world shaped by these women, the throne room begins to feel less like a place of authority and more like a psychological maze designed with meticulous intent. The atmosphere itself becomes a silent instrument of control, and the court learns quickly that fear does not need noise to dominate. Their power operated in a realm where the emotional climate dictated loyalty more effectively than any decree. This is the true architecture of fear that surrounded female rulers who understood that the mind breaks long before the body does, and that anyone living under constant tension becomes predictable, obedient, and dependent. In many ancient and medieval societies, female power was tolerated only when wrapped in caution, suspicion, or necessity. A woman could not simply command respect in the same way a king could. She had to create an environment where resistance felt dangerous, where doubt became corrosive, and where emotional instability served as a strategic advantage. This is why psychological tactics became such a formidable extension of their rule. These women did not rely on traditional legitimacy. They constructed their own systems of influence by shaping the emotional world of everyone around them. When the political stage denied them straightforward authority, they mastered the art of ruling between the lines. Inside these courts, fear functioned like a currency. Every whispered conversation, every subtle glance, every delayed gesture added value to the ruler's presence. The nobles navigating these halls lived in a state of acute awareness, dissecting every interaction for clues. They learned that the absence of communication was sometimes more threatening than a direct order. A queen who remained silent while observing the tension she created gained more control than one issuing commands. That silence made her the only stable point in a room full of anxious minds, and people gravitated toward stability, even if it terrified them. The court also became a place where emotional unpredictability worked as a calculated technique. Some rulers used sharp changes in temperament, shifting from warmth to coldness with surgical precision. These emotional reversals destabilized their advisors, forcing them to seek validation and clarity from the very person generating their confusion. It was a masterstroke of psychological dependency. The more uncertainty they felt, the more desperately they sought to please her. And the more they sought her approval, the tighter her influence became. But what truly distinguishes this environment is how fear extended beyond punishment. It lived inside anticipation, inside the dread of what could happen rather than what did happen. People feared disappointing her, feared misunderstanding her, feared being excluded from her inner circle. In these courts, exile was often more terrifying than execution, because it meant losing access to the one person who held the emotional map of the kingdom. When a woman ruler could make nobles believe that their identity depended on her presence, she no longer needed to raise her voice, let alone raise a weapon. Over time, this psychological landscape shaped an entire political ecosystem. Ministers second-guessed their strategies, generals questioned their decisions, and advisors rewrote their own thoughts to align with the moods of the throne. The court was transformed into a living organism built on hypervigilance, where every action carried the weight of interpretation. Power did not flow from laws or tradition. It flowed from the emotional tension permeating every corner of her domain. And as this tension deepened, a more complex layer of control began to surface, revealing how these women used manipulation not only to intimidate, but to reshape the very identities of those who served them. It is within this environment that the first major psychological tactic emerges with startling clarity, pulling us into the core of their most calculated strategies. What begins to unfold inside these emotionally charged courts is the first major psychological weapon these rulers mastered: the dismantling of perception itself. Control becomes far more potent when people can no longer trust their own interpretation of events, and these women knew how to weave confusion so elegantly that it felt almost natural. The tactic was subtle but devastating, a form of psychological warfare that made every court member question what was real, what was imagined, and who they truly were within the hierarchy she controlled. Gaslighting, long before the term existed, was executed not through crude denial, but through intricate emotional choreography. A ruler might praise a noble with warmth one day and freeze them out the next without explanation. She might assign responsibility for a decision, then later claim she never said such a thing. She might whisper concerns about a trusted advisor to one official, and then reassure that same advisor of her absolute confidence. Each action created microfractures in perception, and those fractures accumulated until individuals no longer recognized their own judgment. Within this unstable environment, loyalty became an internal puzzle each courtier tried to solve. When someone doubted themselves, they became easier to manipulate. These rulers understood that the moment a person starts seeking external validation to confirm their own reality, the balance of power shifts entirely. They crafted scenarios where allies competed for clarity, where rivals doubted their every step, and where hesitation spread like a silent infection. Nothing destroys political cohesion faster than uncertainty, and uncertainty was a weapon she wielded with precision. Conversations in these courts often felt like traps, disguised as invitations. A queen might ask a seemingly innocent question, something as simple as an opinion about a ceremony or a military decision. But the real danger lay in how she responded afterward. If someone answered too confidently, she interpreted it as arrogance. If they answered too cautiously, she treated it as incompetence. The message was clear. Your truth is whatever I decide it is at this moment. That shifting standard forced everyone to constantly recalculate their words, creating a psychological dependency on her reactions. Rumors, too, played a crucial role in destabilizing perception. A queen with mastery over psychological control rarely spread lies directly. Instead, she allowed contradictions to circulate naturally. A single ambiguous comment released into the social bloodstream of the palace could grow into a dozen interpretations, each one conflicting with the next. And when people tried to clarify the truth, she remained deliberately vague, allowing the confusion to deepen. Her silence became the final blow that made the uncertainty permanent. Over time, this system of distortion created an environment where facts held little power compared to emotions. Court members relied on instinct rather than logic, navigating their roles through a fog of unpredictability. They began to mirror her behavior, spreading doubt to others in an effort to gain some semblance of stability. This ripple effect ensured that no one could form alliances strong enough to challenge her influence. Everyone was suspicious of everyone else, and in that fractured landscape, she stood as the only consistent force. What makes this tactic especially chilling is how quietly it operated. There was no spectacle, no grand display of dominance, no public declaration of power. Instead, it seeped into daily interactions, slowly eroding confidence, clarity, and cohesion. And once a ruler succeeded in redefining how her court perceived reality, she gained the ability to manipulate not just decisions, but the emotional foundations behind them. And this psychological breach paved the way for an even darker tactic, one that took fear from the shadows and brought it brutally into the public eye. Once perception had been fractured and the court was suspended in a haze of uncertainty, the next phase of psychological control emerged with far more visible consequences. Public humiliation, when used with calculated precision, became a weapon sharper than any blade. These rulers understood that fear could be multiplied when shame was broadcast before a watching audience, and the target was forced to confront their crumbling identity under the cold gaze of their peers. Humiliation was not a lapse in temper. It was a strategic act meant to redefine power in real time. Banquets, ceremonies, and council gatherings were more than social rituals. They were arenas where psychological dominance was staged. A queen might call attention to a noble's supposed failure in a way that seemed casual, even playful, yet stripped that person of credibility instantly. A misplaced gesture, an alleged oversight, or a fabricated rumor presented as fact could be enough to fracture a reputation that had taken decades to build. And because the audience witnessed it collectively, the humiliation carried a weight that could not be erased privately. The court understood that a single moment of disgrace could determine their entire future. These rulers knew how to wield humiliation not merely as punishment, but as a demonstration of control over social identity. To lose honor was, in many societies, to lose status, security, and the right to be taken seriously. By publicly diminishing someone's value, the queen not only silenced that individual, but also reminded everyone watching that their own identity existed at her mercy. This transformed every gathering into a test of emotional resilience, where each person monitored their behavior obsessively to avoid becoming the next spectacle. Sometimes, the humiliation was subtle, masked by elegance. A queen might offer an insincere compliment that exposed a courtier's insecurity, or call attention to a mistake no one else had noticed. Other times, it was brutal, especially when tied to moral accusations. In medieval courts particularly, the suggestion of impropriety, disloyalty, or forbidden desire could destroy a family's standing overnight. These insinuations spread quickly, amplified by the fear and fascination that permeated the palace. The accused often found themselves isolated, unsure of how the queen truly viewed them, and terrified of defending themselves too boldly. And there were moments when humiliation turned physically symbolic. Being seated at a lower table, being dismissed from a ceremony, being denied the honor of offering counsel. These gestures, though simple, reshaped the hierarchy before everyone's eyes. The court learned to read these signals with acute sensitivity, and the queen ensured her power remained untouchable by constantly reminding them that reputation could be dismantled as easily as a whispered remark. What made this tactic especially effective was the psychological aftermath it left behind. Humiliated individuals became unpredictable. Some withdrew, others sought revenge, and many became even more submissive, desperate to regain approval. Each reaction served the queen's strategy, because instability among her subjects meant greater stability for her authority. In this environment, no one could rise too confidently, and no alliance could feel fully secure. Humiliation, wielded skillfully, ensured that fear spread exponentially through the hierarchy, reinforcing the invisible architecture of control established earlier. And as these public displays continued, another layer of manipulation began taking shape, one rooted not in the social arena, but in something far more ancient and deeply embedded in human belief. Before we explore how these women harnessed superstition, prophecy, and divine fear, tell me in the comments which type of humiliation you think would have been most psychologically devastating in a medieval court, and why. As the court absorbed the shock of public humiliation and its lingering tension, another layer of control began to seep through the palace walls, one that reached deeper than social hierarchy or emotional instability. This was the realm where fear took on a spiritual dimension, where rulers blended political authority with divine influence to create a power structure no mortal could easily resist. When a queen could convince her court that her decisions carried the weight of cosmic judgment, obedience transformed from a strategic necessity into a sacred obligation. And in societies where religion shaped every aspect of life, this psychological weapon became almost impossible to counter. The brilliance of this tactic lay in its ambiguity. These rulers rarely claimed outright divinity, but instead positioned themselves near the boundaries of the sacred. They consulted oracles, employed priestesses, interpreted dreams, or performed rituals at strategic moments, allowing those around them to draw their own conclusions. People in ancient and medieval courts were already conditioned to fear the unseen. The queen simply became its most articulate representative. Her warnings sounded prophetic, her instincts felt supernatural, and her silence took on a mystical significance that no one dared question. Manipulating. Religious fear did not require fabricating miracles. All it took was the careful release of signs and symbols at moments of heightened tension. A sudden eclipse, an unusual storm, a troubling omen, any of these could be framed as validation of her authority. If a rival challenged her, a conveniently timed prophecy might circulate, hinting at divine disapproval. If an advisor hesitated, she might consult a sacred text and return with a passage that seemed tailored to their situation. These gestures blurred the boundary between political maneuvering and spiritual mandate, reinforcing the belief that resisting her was equivalent to resisting fate itself. The psychological impact of this strategy was immense. People obeyed not just because they feared punishment, but because they feared cosmic consequences. This created a profound internal conflict. Disloyalty carried not only the risk of exile or disgrace, but the weight of spiritual guilt. The queen could observe the turmoil in her subjects' faces, the hesitation before speaking, the need for reassurance, the quick glances toward religious symbols that adorned the halls. She had managed to infiltrate the private thoughts of her court, shaping their morality to align with her interests. In some cases, these rulers used religious intermediaries to amplify their influence. A trusted priestess or oracle could deliver messages on their behalf, disguised as divine insight. These intermediaries often acted with theatrical precision, aware of the psychological effect their words had on the public. And because their pronouncements came from outside the political hierarchy, they appeared unbiased, lending credibility to the queen's strategic intentions. The court quickly learned that any attempt to question these revelations risked not only political backlash, but spiritual condemnation. Over time, the palaces ruled by such women took on an atmosphere of ritualized tension. Every corridor held the weight of portent. Every gathering felt like an initiation into something larger than politics. Even those who doubted privately found themselves swayed by the collective fear, unable to stand alone against the tide of belief. This tactic created a psychological environment where rational thought competed with existential dread, and most people surrendered to the path of least resistance. But behind the glow of candles and the echo of whispered prophecies lay a darker truth. These rulers did not rely solely on divine manipulation. They also employed tactics that exploited the deepest human vulnerabilities, weaving desire, affection, and jealousy into their web of control. As spiritual fear tightened its grip on the court, the next weapon emerged quietly, crafted not from the heavens, but from the fragile landscape of human emotion. As the weight of divine fear settled over the court, another force began to weave its way through the emotional landscape of those who lived closest to the throne. Unlike prophecies or omens, this tactic did not rely on ritual or symbolism. It unfolded in the private chambers, in whispered conversations, in the delicate intersections of admiration and longing. Seduction, jealousy, and abandonment became political instruments, capable of shaping allegiance with far more precision than any decree. These rulers understood that desire was not merely a personal weakness, but a predictable pattern of human behavior, and one that could be tugged, tightened, and snapped to serve their strategic needs. The power of this tactic came from its invisibility. No one could openly accuse the queen of manipulation when her gestures were wrapped in grace and subtlety. A lingering glance at a banquet, a soft word of encouragement during a moment of vulnerability, or a calculated expression of disappointment could shift a man's loyalty more effectively than threats. These women recognized that emotional attention, even the smallest amount, could create a bond stronger than fear. And once that bond formed, it became a lever they could pull whenever political tension demanded it. But seduction in these courts did not always involve physical intimacy. Often it rested on attention, the sense of being chosen, singled out, seen. A general who believed he held special favor might push harder on the battlefield or defend the queen more fiercely in council. A young noblewoman who received her approval might become an unexpected ally, eager to prove her worth. This emotional currency circulated quietly, yet it transformed the political climate with profound efficiency. Jealousy was the second blade of this tactic. It was deployed with extraordinary precision, sometimes through simple gestures, calling upon one advisor more frequently than another, offering private counsel to someone newly arrived, or showing a brief moment of affection toward a rival spouse. These small shifts in attention ignited rivalries that consumed the court. People became desperate to regain her favor, convinced that every interaction carried hidden meaning. They internalized the competition, measuring their worth against one another, unaware that the game had been designed to keep them off balance. And then came the final stage, abandonment. After raising someone's emotional investment, the queen might suddenly withdraw. The silence was intentional, heavy, and unnerving. Those who had once basked in her attention found themselves cut adrift, stripped of the validation they had grown dependent on. This emotional void became a powerful tool. Men who once acted with confidence now second-guessed every decision, terrified that they had fallen from grace. Women who had felt protected found themselves isolated, unsure of how to navigate the shifting social terrain. The queen became the only source of stability, the only person who could restore the sense of worth she had taken away. The unpredictability of this cycle, affection, tension, withdrawal, created a psychological rhythm that kept the entire court in motion. People adjusted their behavior to match her emotional climate, hoping to avoid the sting of abandonment or the chaos of jealousy. In this environment, even powerful figures became vulnerable, trapped by the desire for approval they could never fully obtain. The queen's influence seeped into their identities, shaping how they saw themselves and how they interpreted the world around them. This tactic worked because it exploited a universal truth. People crave connection, recognition, and emotional certainty. By controlling the supply of these needs, a woman in power could command loyalty without issuing a single order. And yet, emotional manipulation was only one layer of her arsenal. As the court grew more desperate for her approval and more fearful of her silence, she prepared to unveil techniques far harsher and more demanding, designed to test the very limits of human loyalty. As emotional manipulation tightened its grip on the court, the next tactic these rulers employed revealed just how deeply they understood human vulnerability. It was not enough to control perception or stir desire. True dominance required testing loyalty in ways that left no room for doubt. These women crafted scenarios that forced their subjects to expose their true intentions, to choose between comfort and obedience, between personal allegiance and survival. And they did so with a subtlety that made each test feel both inevitable and impossible to foresee. Loyalty tests began with small demands, framed as harmless requests. A queen might ask a trusted advisor to deliver a message that contradicted their personal beliefs, or to support a decision they privately questioned. Observing how they hesitated, how they phrased their response, how quickly they complied, these tiny reactions told her everything she needed to know. The court never realized that their obedience was being measured long before the stakes became life-altering. But as the political climate grew more tense, the tests became more elaborate. A ruler might orchestrate a conflict between two loyal subjects, presenting each with different versions of the same story and waiting to see who would defend her interpretation. She might intentionally leak false information to determine who would spread it. She might even stage moments of vulnerability, revealing a fabricated weakness to watch who tried to exploit it. Each test peeled back the layers of those around her, exposing ambition, fear, insecurity, and loyalty in their rawest form. Threats also played an essential role, though they rarely appeared as direct warnings. In these courts, a simple shift in tone could feel like a sentence. A delayed invitation to a private meeting signaled potential disfavor. A missed glance across the hall whispered that someone had fallen out of her grace. People lived in constant analysis of her behavior, trying to decode signals that were often intentionally contradictory. This emotional hypervigilance kept them compliant, too afraid to challenge her, and too unsure to trust one another. And then came the punishments, sharp, decisive, and deeply symbolic. A noble might be reassigned to a distant province, exiled under the guise of political necessity. A general might be stripped of command without explanation. A lady-in-waiting might be quietly dismissed, her absence noted only by those who understood the true meaning of such a disappearance. These punishments were rarely brutal in a physical sense, but psychologically devastating. Losing one's position meant losing identity, influence, and the protection of the throne. Some punishments were designed to unsettle the entire court. A respected minister could be demoted in front of others, not because he had failed, but because she wanted to remind everyone how quickly status could collapse. Even those untouched by the punishment felt its sting, imagining themselves in the same position. And that fear kept them aligned with her expectations, no matter how unpredictable those expectations became. What made these loyalty tests so effective was their unpredictability. People never knew when they were being watched, or when a seemingly ordinary conversation was actually a trial. They lived suspended between anxiety and aspiration, trying to prove their devotion without appearing desperate. This tension hollowed out their sense of autonomy, replacing personal conviction with an ever-growing dependence on her approval. As the court bent under the weight of these silent evaluations, a new dimension of power emerged, one built not from the ruler alone, but from a network of women who operated in the background, gathering secrets and sharpening the edges of fear. Before we explore the hidden machinery behind these silent enforcers of psychological control, tell me in the comments which type of loyalty test you believe would have been the most psychologically destructive and why. The deeper one looks into these courts, the clearer it becomes that the Queen's power did not operate in isolation. Behind the throne existed an intricate network of women whose roles appeared ordinary, but whose influence extended into every corner of the palace. These attendants, priestesses, companions, and silent observers formed a living web of information, carrying whispers from room to room, mapping the emotional currents of the court with astonishing precision. Their presence transformed the palace from a political institution into a surveillance ecosystem where no gesture, no hesitation, and no private expression went unnoticed. These women occupied positions that granted them natural access to intimacy. A lady-in-waiting might help the queen dress, overhearing reluctant confessions from those waiting outside the chamber. A servant responsible for cleaning rooms might discover letters left half-hidden under pillows or traces of meetings, held in secret. A young attendant might accompany a noblewoman during moments of vulnerability, absorbing emotional details she later conveyed through subtler channels. Their insights were not gathered through interrogation, but through observation, which made their intelligence all the more valuable. What made this network so powerful was its invisibility. Men at court often underestimated these women, dismissing their presence as background noise or emotional support. They failed to recognize that the Queen's most critical information rarely came from formal reports. It flowed through this undercurrent of quiet, persistent awareness. Each woman served as a set of eyes and ears, feeding the Queen a continuous stream of emotional and political indicators. This allowed her to anticipate threats long before they surfaced and to exploit hidden fractures within the court before anyone realized they existed. The web extended beyond the palace walls. Market women, midwives, temple attendants, and even traveling entertainers carried stories that eventually found their way to the Queen. In many societies, the most private exchanges occurred in female spaces, during childbirth, washing rituals, festivals, or sacred ceremonies. Through these channels, the Queen received information that male advisors could never access. This gave her a psychological advantage that few rulers possessed. A complete portrait of the kingdom's emotional landscape, from the anxieties of nobles to the fears of commoners. This network also allowed her to shape narratives indirectly. A carefully seeded rumor passed through the mouths of attendants could reach the court as though it had emerged organically. A subtle shift in tone from a priestess could influence the spiritual mood of an entire region. Even a single whispered warning, delivered at the right moment by the right woman, could redirect political momentum. These actions created the illusion that the Queen's power was omnipresent. that her awareness extended into places no ruler should logically reach. And because these women operated without formal titles or visible authority, they were nearly impossible to confront. Anyone who suspected their involvement risked appearing paranoid or disrespectful. The queen relied on this ambiguity, allowing her network to move silently, gathering information that strengthened her control while keeping her hands clean of any direct surveillance. This separation between action and appearance preserved her image while amplifying her influence. Over time, the court internalized the sense that someone was always listening. Conversations shifted from candid to cautious, even in private chambers. People rehearsed their words, monitored their expressions, and questioned the loyalty of those closest to them. This constant vigilance eroded trust, pushing the court further into the emotional disarray the queen needed to maintain dominance. Through this invisible network of women, she orchestrated a psychological environment where every whispered thought felt like a potential risk. Yet even with this intricate system of quiet control, there remained a deeper consequence waiting to unfold, one that revealed the psychological cost of living under such a shadow, not only for the court, but for the ruler herself. And as the structure of fear expanded to engulf everyone within its reach, the emotional foundations of the entire empire began to shift in ways no one could fully predict. As the queen's invisible network tightened around the court, and fear became the currency of survival, the psychological toll on everyone within the palace began to reveal itself in ways far more destructive than open conflict. Power built on emotional destabilization did not simply control behavior. It altered identities, rewired instincts, and reshaped the internal worlds of those who lived under its shadow. What had started as subtle manipulation now evolved into a collective condition, a kind of mental corrosion that spread through the hierarchy like an unseen contagion. The first signs appeared in the relationships between the nobles. Once bound by shared lineage or political interest, they gradually transformed into fragmented individuals, each consumed by private anxieties. Suspicion seeped into their interactions. A gesture that once signaled friendship now felt loaded with hidden meaning. A pause in conversation could be mistaken for betrayal. These shifts did not happen all at once. They emerged slowly, a constant undercurrent of unease that grew stronger with each unspoken fear. The queen no longer needed to intervene. Her previous tactics had planted seeds that now flourished on their own. Generals who once commanded armies with unwavering confidence became hesitant, second-guessing every strategic decision. Advisors who prided themselves on rational thinking found themselves trapped in loops of doubt, unable to trust their interpretations of events. Even those who believed themselves immune to manipulation discovered that the atmosphere of uncertainty had eroded their emotional resilience. It was not the queen who haunted them, but the instability she had engineered, a psychological state that outlived any single command or confrontation. In many of these courts, paranoia became a defining characteristic. People monitored their own expressions, aware that any visible discomfort could be interpreted as disloyalty. They rehearsed conversations before speaking, choosing their words with excruciating care. They avoided forming alliances too openly, fearful that proximity might draw unwanted attention. The palace, once a center of refined culture and ceremonial grandeur, felt more like a labyrinth where every turn presented a new threat. And the queen, watching from the center of this constructed maze, understood that fear was most effective when it became self-sustaining. The emotional damage extended beyond the court's elite. Ladies-in-waiting, attendants, scribes, musicians, and messengers all absorbed the tension radiating from those above them. Young servants learned early that the safest expression was neutrality, that curiosity was dangerous, and that trust was a luxury they could not afford. This created a generational ripple, shaping new members of the court long before they had any direct interaction with the queen herself. By the time they rose to positions of influence, the psychological landscape had already shaped them into cautious, anxious participants in her system. But perhaps the most striking impact was on the Queen's own family. Heirs raised in this environment often inherited the emotional fractures it produced. Some grew cold, mirroring the same manipulation they had witnessed. Others became volatile, unable to distinguish genuine affection from strategic attention. Their upbringing, steeped in fear and uncertainty, stripped them of the stability necessary to lead effectively. And yet, these consequences rarely deterred the Queen. She believed that emotional instability in her successors only reinforced her own authority in the present. As the years progressed, the psychological consequences compounded. The court became a living demonstration of what happens when fear is used not merely as a tool, but as a foundation. What had begun as a method for establishing control now evolved into an atmosphere where emotional deterioration became inevitable. And from this deteriorating structure emerged a final, unsettling question, one that challenges the very assumption that such rulers could maintain their grip indefinitely. For when the cost of fear grows too high, even the most carefully constructed systems begin to fracture from within, reshaping the balance of power in unexpected ways. The longer one studies these courts shaped by fear, the clearer it becomes that the psychological tactics used by these women reveal something far more enduring than the dynamics of a distant era. Their strategies were born from the tension between limitation and ambition, from the need to forge influence in structures designed to exclude them. And in doing so, they exposed patterns that still echo today in subtle, unsettling ways. Power built on emotional manipulation, strategic uncertainty, and psychological fragmentation did not remain confined to ancient palaces. It resurfaced throughout history, adapted itself to new environments, and embedded itself in the ways leaders across eras shape their authority. When fear becomes a system rather than a moment, it alters the very atmosphere of governance. It creates environments where people conform not out of respect, but out of a lingering dread that their thoughts might betray them. These queens understood that fear was not a punishment, but a framework, one that guided every decision made in their presence. This framework outlasted battles, outlasted political upheavals, and often outlasted the women themselves. The traces remained in the generals who hesitated, the advisors who doubted, the heirs who grew into rulers shaped by shadows rather than principles. But the most revealing truth lies not in the tactics themselves, but in what they exposed about human nature. People across all ranks, nobles, servants, commanders, attendants, responded in predictable ways to uncertainty. They sought approval, stability, and emotional clarity, even when those needs bound them to a ruler who used those desires as weapons. This dependence created a cycle that fed the Queen's authority, turning the palace into a psychological ecosystem that sustained itself long after the original act of manipulation had passed. The court lived inside the emotional gravity of the throne, unable to escape its pull, and still, the structure eventually bent under its own weight. Systems built on fear rarely collapse from rebellion alone. They fracture internally, one quiet break at a time. A trusted advisor loses faith in his ability to interpret the Queen's intentions. A noblewoman reaches the limit of emotional exhaustion. A rival senses instability and exploits it. Even the Queen herself can become trapped in the landscape she created, relying so heavily on control that she loses the ability to distinguish genuine loyalty from fear-driven compliance. Paranoia turns inward, and the crown becomes heavier than even the most powerful mind can bear. Yet this pattern, as dark as it is, forces a deeper question about today's world. These tactics survive not because they belong to queens of the past, but because they exploit psychological mechanisms that remain alive in modern relationships, workplaces, and systems of power. Emotional dependency, strategic silence, selective approval, weaponized uncertainty. They reappear in new forms, hidden behind contemporary language and structures. The ancient past becomes a mirror, reflecting tendencies that many prefer not to acknowledge. Understanding these queens is not simply revisiting history. It is confronting the uncomfortable truth that psychological dominance evolves rather than disappears. Their methods reveal the vulnerabilities built into the human mind, the ways fear can be dressed in elegance, and the speed with which trust can be reshaped by someone who understands its fragility. And in recognizing these patterns, we open the door to asking whether true power ever belonged to the throne, or whether it always lived in the shadows cast by those who mastered the art of influencing the unseen. If you reached this point of the video, your perspective on these rulers has probably shifted in some way. Before we wrap this journey, consider leaving a comment saying the phrase, "I stayed until the last shadow, so I know you were here until the end and connected with this deeper layer of history." And if this exploration added something meaningful to the way you see power, manipulation, or the hidden psychology behind leadership, you can subscribe to the channel to stay close as we continue uncovering the darker corners of the past. A like on the video also helps keep this kind of content alive, making it easier for others who seek depth to find it. And if you want to continue this journey, there is a video right here on the side that expands on these themes in a way that complements everything we explored. Follow the thread and keep discovering the stories history tried to bury.